When you think of a medieval castle siege, you probably picture catapults hurling massive stones, walls crumbling, and a final desperate battle in the courtyard. Hollywood has sold us this image for decades, the dramatic, explosive end, but that's not how it usually happened. Actually, the most powerful weapon in a siege wasn't the trebuchet, it wasn't Greek fire. It was something much slower, much quieter, and far more effective. It was time. Surviving a siege wasn't about winning a single glorious battle. It was about outlasting your opponent. It was an ugly, brutal, and incredibly boring waiting game. The castle itself was designed for exactly this. It was a machine built for waiting. And understanding how this machine worked means starting from the very beginning, long before a single stone was laid. The first and most important step to surviving a siege was choosing where to build the castle in the first place. Location was everything. You'll never see a major medieval castle built in a random flat field. They were always placed with defense in mind. The most obvious choice was a hill. A high point gave defenders a massive advantage. It meant attackers had to fight an exhausting uphill battle just to reach the walls. It also gave lookouts a commanding view of the surrounding countryside, so nobody could sneak up on them. An approaching army could be spotted miles away, giving the castle days to prepare. But not every strategic location was a convenient hill. Sometimes the best spot was on a bend in a river, using the water as a natural moat on 2 or 3 sides. Or on a coastal cliff, making an attack from the sea nearly impossible. Look at a castle like Dover in England. It sits on the famous White Cliffs, a natural fortress that only really needs to be defended from one direction, the landward side. This strategic placement was the first layer of defense. It was a passive, permanent advantage that the attackers had to deal with every single day of the siege. It forced them to set up camp in less than ideal locations, often in marshy or exposed ground, while the defenders sat comfortably high and dry. So, once you had your location, you had to build the walls. And medieval walls were not just simple curtains of stone. They were complex defensive systems. The classic image is of a tall, flat wall, but by the High Middle Ages, that design was obsolete. Attackers learned that focusing their siege engines on one spot could bring a flat wall down. So castle builders adapted. They started building round towers into the walls. A round surface is much more effective at deflecting a projectile than a flat one. A stone that might shatter a flat wall could glance off a curved tower with much less damage. Also, these towers projected outwards from the wall line. This was absolutely critical. It eliminated blind spots. From the top of a tower, archers could fire down along the face of the connecting wall, a practice called flanking fire. Anyone trying to place a ladder or a mining tunnel at the base of the wall was completely exposed to fire from 2 or even 3 directions. There was simply nowhere to hide. Then you have the top of the walls. The iconic battlements, the up and down pattern you see on every fairy tale castle. Those weren't for decoration. The solid parts, the merlins, provided cover for defenders. The gaps, the crenels, allowed them to shoot back. And later, they added another feature, machicolations. These were openings in the floor of the overhanging battlements. They allowed defenders to drop things directly onto the heads of anyone at the base of the wall. Not just boiling oil, which was actually quite rare because oil was expensive, but rocks, heavy timbers, boiling water, and even sand. Heated sand was particularly nasty. It could get inside armor and cause horrific burns. The entrance was always the weakest point, so it had to be the strongest. The gatehouse wasn't just a gate, it was a death trap. An approaching enemy would first have to cross a moat, often under heavy fire. If they made it, they might face a drawbridge. Then came the gate itself, usually made of thick wood reinforced with iron. But behind that was the real weapon, the portcullis. A heavy iron or wooden grill that could be dropped in an instant, trapping attackers in a narrow passageway. This passage was called the killing field. It would have arrow slits on both sides and murder holes in the ceiling above. Attackers trapped between the portcullis and a second inner gate would be annihilated from all sides without being able to fight back. Some advanced gatehouses had multiple portcullises and several twists and turns, making any direct assault suicidal. The gatehouse was designed to make the attackers pay for every single foot of ground they gained. So the physical defenses were formidable, but they were useless without the one thing a castle needed to outlast an enemy: supplies. A siege was fundamentally a contest of logistics. The attacking army had to bring all of its food, water, and equipment with it. The castle, on the other hand, could stockpile for months or even years. The most important resource was water. A castle had to have its own secure water source. The most common solution was a well dug deep within the castle walls, usually in the central keep or the main courtyard. This well was protected at all costs. Poisoning an enemy's water supply was a common tactic of ancient and medieval warfare. If a castle's well was compromised, the siege was over in days. Some castles also had cisterns, large underground tanks designed to collect rainwater, providing a backup supply. Then came food. Preparing for a siege meant gathering immense quantities of non-perishable food. This was mostly grains like wheat and rye, which could be stored for a long time and ground into flour to bake bread. You would also find huge stockpiles of salted meat and fish, cheese, beans, and dried fruit. Livestock would be brought inside the castle walls to provide a source of fresh meat and milk, at least for a while. A large castle like Crac des Chevaliers in Syria was said to have been able to hold out for 5 years thanks to its massive storage capabilities. This stockpile determined the castle's lifespan. The commander of the castle would know exactly how much food they had and how many people they needed to feed. Rations would be calculated and strictly enforced from day one. It was a grim countdown. Everyone inside knew that if a relief army didn't arrive before the food ran out, their only options were starvation or surrender. Of course, a castle is just a pile of rocks without people to defend it. The garrison was the active part of the defense. This wasn't just a mob of peasants with pitchforks. A professional garrison was made up of trained soldiers, men-at-arms, and specialist archers, particularly crossbowmen. The crossbow was an amazing defensive weapon. It required less training than the longbow, but it was incredibly powerful, capable of punching through most armor of the period. And a defender could stand behind a merlin, take his time loading, step out to shoot, and then step back into cover. The size of the garrison varied wildly. A small watchtower might only have a dozen men. A major royal castle could have hundreds. But you didn't actually need that many soldiers to defend a well-designed castle. The walls did most of the work. The goal of the garrison wasn't to defeat the entire enemy army. Their job was simply to prevent the enemy from getting over, under, or through the walls. They had to repair damage from siege engines, put out fires, and repel any direct assaults. It was exhausting, dangerous, and repetitive work. But the real enemy for the people inside was often not the army outside, but the conditions inside. Castles were not comfortable places. During a siege, they became overcrowded and unsanitary. You had soldiers, servants, local villagers who had taken refuge, and animals all crammed into a small enclosed space. Waste disposal was a serious problem. While some castles had latrines called garderobes that emptied outside the walls, these could become a security risk. More often, waste was simply dumped in pits or corners of the courtyard. After weeks or months, the stench would have been unimaginable. And with poor sanitation comes disease. A single sick person could start an outbreak of something like dysentery, which could sweep through the crowded castle and kill more defenders than the enemy ever could. This was the great equalizer. The attacking army, living in a crowded and often filthy siege camp, faced the exact same threat. In many cases, a siege ended not because of a military victory, but because one side was so ravaged by disease that it could no longer function. This leads to the psychological aspect of siege warfare. It was a battle of wills. The attackers wanted to convince the defenders that their situation was hopeless. They would use intimidation tactics. They might launch diseased animal carcasses or human heads over the walls to spread fear and sickness. They would shout taunts and insults. They would execute prisoners in full view of the defenders to show them the fate that awaited them. The goal was to break their morale, to make the defenders feel isolated, forgotten, and doomed. The commander of the castle had to counter this. They had to maintain discipline, keep up morale, and project an image of confidence. They might hang banners from the walls or even hurl their own taunts back.
There's a famous story, possibly a legend, of a lady of a castle under siege throwing her last pig over the walls to convince the attackers they had so much food they could afford to waste it. The bluff worked, and the discouraged attackers packed up and left. While the defenders waited, the attackers worked. They had a whole toolbox of techniques to try and breach the walls. The most visually impressive were the siege engines. The trebuchet was the king of these. It was a massive counterweight-powered machine that could hurl enormous stones, weighing hundreds of pounds, over incredible distances with surprising accuracy. It was a weapon of attrition. A trebuchet could batter the same spot on a wall or tower for days or weeks, slowly weakening the stone until it collapsed. But building and operating a trebuchet was a major undertaking. They were built on-site from timber sourced from the local area, which is another reason deforestation often followed in the wake of a medieval army. They required skilled engineers to construct and aim, and a lot of manpower to operate. For a more direct assault, attackers might use siege towers. These were huge wooden towers on wheels, often covered in wet animal hides to protect them from fire. They would be slowly rolled up to the castle walls. If a tower reached the wall, a drawbridge would drop from its top, allowing attackers to pour directly onto the battlements. The defenders' main goal was to destroy these towers before they got close, using their own catapults, fire arrows, or by making sorties out of the castle to burn them. The most insidious tactic, however, was mining. A team of specialists called miners would dig a tunnel up to the base of a castle wall. They did this under the cover of a protective shed called a cat or a sow. Once they reached the foundation, they would dig out a chamber directly underneath the wall, propping up the ceiling with wooden beams. When the chamber was complete, they would fill it with flammable material like pig fat and brushwood and set it on fire. The fire would burn away the wooden props, the foundation would lose its support, and the section of wall above would simply collapse, creating a breach. This was the defenders' greatest fear. It was a silent, hidden attack that could instantly render their strongest defenses useless. To counter it, defenders would listen for the telltale sounds of digging. They might put bowls of water on the ground to detect vibrations. If they found a mine, they would dig a countermine to intercept it and fight a brutal underground battle with the enemy miners. So, the castle had its defenses, and the attackers had their weapons. It was a constant back and forth, a technological and psychological arms race. But after all this, after the trebuchets and the mines and the starvation and the disease, you have to ask why a siege would finally end. Very few sieges ended with a final heroic storming of the castle. That was incredibly costly for the attacker, with a high chance of failure. The most common reason a siege ended was because a relief army arrived. The defenders' primary strategy was always to hold out long enough for help to come. An army busy conducting a siege was vulnerable. It was tied to one location. If a friendly army appeared, the besiegers would be trapped between the castle and the new threat, forcing them to either abandon the siege or fight a battle on two fronts. Another common reason was simple negotiation. If the defenders knew no help was coming and they were weeks from starvation, the commander might negotiate a surrender. The terms could vary. They might be allowed to march out with their weapons and banners, surrendering the castle but saving their lives. Or, if they had held out for too long and angered the attacker, they could expect no mercy. And perhaps the most common and most anticlimactic reason of all was that the attacker simply gave up. Sieges were unbelievably expensive. An army had to be paid and fed every single day. The cost of building siege engines, paying mercenaries, and shipping supplies was astronomical. A king or a lord could literally go bankrupt trying to take a single stubborn castle. Often, after a few months with no progress, with disease running through their camp and winter approaching, the attacking commander would just cut his losses, pack up, and go home. So surviving a siege wasn't about one climactic moment. It was a slow, agonizing process. It was about having the better location, the thicker walls, the deeper well, and the bigger stockpile of grain.
It was about the garrison's discipline, the commander's nerve, and the psychological will to endure weeks and months of misery and boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. The castle was a fortress, yes, but it was also a clock. And the side that could control time was the side that would ultimately win.